Well, hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today it's a long-awaited vinyl shootout. The final installation of the Steely Dan catalog with Analogue Productions has come, the Royal Scam. This is a 2x45RPM LP on UHQR Clarity vinyl, 2 LPs pressed at 45 RPM at Quality Record Pressings in Salina, Kansas, and produced by Analogue Productions. How does this one fare? Well, I've got some originals, including an old $4.99 sticker on one. I've got a US promo and a UK first pressing as well. We're going to see how the new UHQR stacks up against them as we take our next Safe and Sound Texas audio excursion. So this has been a long-awaited one. There have been delays in these coming out with the scheduling managed and overseen by Universal. Now that it has been released, we've got them all. Well, the Steely Dan catalog has been special in a lot of different ways, partly because of the great mastering that has been done over time by Bernie Grundman, the production by Gary Katz, the engineering by Roger the Immortal Nichols, and all of the session musicians that have contributed to the Steely Dan catalog. Now, the Royal Scam was released on May 31st of 1976. It was their 5th album. Now, this one didn't have high critical acclaim, except for Rolling Stone magazine, which said it was their best to date. But this was an album that had a lot of cynical lyrics about cheaters and out-of-towners and drug dealers. You know, the kind of thing Steely Dan liked to talk about. But it got a little more harsh in this album. Ironically, this was the last album before Asia came out, which was kind of transformative for Steely Dan overall. The album didn't yield but 2 singles in the United States, Kid Charlemagne and The Fez, but neither single did very well, and the single Haitian Divorce only came out in the UK, and it didn't do very well either. But over time, this album has become more and more respected and liked. And so, with this last installment, it's a matter of seeing how did this new remastering job that was done by Bernie Grundman at Bernie Grundman Studios and supervised by Chad Kassem at Analogue Productions. Now, in case you don't know, the way it works is Bernie will do a master for Chad and send the lacquer, and then Chad will press some test pressings at his pressing plant. And then he will listen to those side by side against other copies, at least typically, of course, the United States original or white label promo. I also had a white label promo sent to me. Thank you, my friend down in Houston, for sending that. So I'm going to be hearing the same kind of comparisons that Chad had. Additionally, I'll have a first pressing from the UK. And so Bernie sends him that and he listens to it and he comes back to Bernie and says either that's good, let's leave it as is, or here's what I want changed. Now, each of the sides, the 4 sides in this 2 LP 45 RPM, have their own indication in the dead wax of which one of the actual cuts that he chose. And in this case, as in I think the first case of any of them, they all were the same, RE-2, which means it was the 3rd, because the first one has no RE revision, and then you have RE1, and then you have RE2, etc., etc. So these all were the 3rd cut. This album, I had to really refamiliarize myself with a lot because honestly, it isn't one of my favorite Steely Dan records. But I sure grew some respect for it now, having to listen to it again several times, of course. But what really bowled me over, and I didn't expect it, was that the original was very top heavy. It was very bright to the point of shrill. And that wasn't expected. And so for me, it was a matter then of comparing it to the UK version before I got the Royal Scam from Analogue Productions literally today, this afternoon. I've been literally chomping at the bit to get it. And so in making that comparison between the white label promo and the UK, it was very obvious the difference there on the top end. And it seems to me on the UK version, they actually tried to tamp down some of that top end and add some boosting to the bottom for compensation. So I was kind of interested where the Analogue Productions would fall, given the fact that we had a US version that was biased toward the top, and we had a UK version that was a little more biased toward the bottom end. Neither one was dissatisfying in any way, but I would say without a doubt that the US having that high end being that shrill got fatiguing. And I will say that the UK trying to boost the bottom muddled some things and moved some things around in the soundstage that really changed the way my perspective was on the record. So it's funny, these things are done in an attempt to come up with the best outcome, and that's exactly what Analogue Productions is doing in this particular release. So, as always, let's see what it means with the numbers. The nature of audio comparisons is that the results presented in this video are fully subjective. They are based on my equipment in my listening room using my hearing capability. Therefore, your results may be different. My effort here is to provide you the relative difference of audio characteristics across various pressings. So we have the US first pressing, which is a white label promo, and it was mastered and the lacquer was cut by Alan Zent. The LP was pressed at Columbia, Santa Maria, California, one of the more reputable plants in the United States pressing records. In the UK, the first pressing that we have, we don't see any way to get provenance on who did the mastering, but we do know that it was pressed at the CBS pressing plant in Aston, Clinton. And finally, of course, the reissue now by Analogue Productions 2x45 LP, mastered and lacquer cut by Bernie Grunman and pressed at QRP. The price differences on that promo original, they go for around $50 or more. Whereas on the UK, you can get those for about $40, and I'm including shipment on that one only because there was only one in the US that you could get that I saw at all. So the US one is definitely one you can find many different copies of. Finding a promo, however, would be a lot harder to do than just a regular pressing. I did have a different US pressing than the Santa Maria, and it was an Alan Zent as well, and it sounded the same as the Columbia Santa Maria actually. So you can find those out there for even less than the 50. The 50 was on the promo, which is more pricey. As it relates to the relative decibels, we had a very easy time on this because the match was on the UK and US, they were really the same. It was slightly a little less on the Analogue Productions. I had to boost it up just a hair, so it was about 1 dB quieter, so to speak, than the others. The quietness of the vinyl on the US original, it was an 8, pretty quiet for the time, and the UK was a little better, 8.5. And then when we get to the Analogue Productions, it was dead quiet. I mean, this record had no pops, no ticks, and I played it first before I cleaned it. So I like to listen to it the way it comes from the factory. And this thing, even taking a brush over it lightly at the beginning before I started and rolling that off to the top of my plinth, which I had wiped off, I mean, there was barely a speck of dust that came up on any of the four sides. So it was really clean. Glad to see that. So it got a 10. It was really, really quiet. When it comes to the actual sonics of the bass, the mid, and the treble, this is the meat of the frequencies. So as it related to the bass, the US pressing had good presence there. This isn't a bass-heavy kind of album, honestly. It got a 9. And again, the UK, we talked about earlier about this really trying to bump it up down there, artificially somewhat. And so when I have something that is a bit of an excess in a category that I think is a negative, the rating over 10 reduces its value. It doesn't make it better, it reduces it. So it does take off. In this case, it shaves off a half a point from that total sonic average that it gets when you put all the other numbers together. So it definitely has a negative effect. And the same occurred when we looked at the US pressing when it related to treble. It had the same kind of issue where it was in fact too much. So we have bass on the Analogue Productions that's very solid, not forced. It's there. There could maybe be a tad more, but not to the point where you'd want to force it like it was on the UK. So it got a 9.5. On the mids, I just say that the US pressing was better in that area in some ways because it was maybe present in the upper echelon just a bit more, whereas on the UK, the mid was kind of covered up a bit because of that lower end trying to compensate. And the sweet spot was the Analogue Productions at 9.5. It seemed to balance them very well, as it did on the treble, because we had a little bit too much on the original US, we had too little on the UK. So it's the Mama Bear, Papa Bear, and Baby Bear kind of thing, where we're getting it just right. And that's the porridge that we got in this Analogue Productions release. Dynamic range was really good on the original. It was really keeping up and giving you those hits and things that were showing you. It was pumping and giving you a top end and a bottom end, a very wider range, whereas the UK was squished more. It didn't have as much in that regard. And ironically, the attempt to increase the bottom end on the UK failed in the point where it really didn't increase it at any lower, like a woofer level. It was more in the mid bass, and it was, it clouded over sounds. And so it really didn't dig deep enough to really have that effect to give you a wide range in the dynamic range. Potentially, they tried to even do a little bit of compression to push some things, whereas the Analogue Productions was right on the money, 9.5, good, strong, dynamic range. Soundstage and imaging was decent on the original. Some of that was masked, I would say, a bit by the intensity of the treble, I would say, and so you lost a little bit of that. Similarly, you lost some of that in the UK because of trying to go a little more on the mid bass down there, and things were a little more stovepiped or in a silo related to hanging over the speaker as opposed to having any depth and presence, which you realize when you play the Analogue Productions, because things opened up and breathed more. And the general separation that you heard on the Analogue Productions was much better. There were instruments that were present in the Analogue Productions that got buried somewhat, either in the highs of the OG or in the attempt to push the bottom with the UK, whereas they kind of just lived and breathed when you listened to it on the Analogue Productions, along with, again, a more separation that gave you some distinctions in the characteristics of the music and the vocals. Speaking of the vocals, again, similar here on the ratings to Soundstage and Imaging, an 8.5, decent for the OG, but again, some places where the Fagen's voice just got a little raspy. And on the UK, his voice got a little bit covered up a bit. So that's kind of the tail of the tape when it comes to those two, whereas we're back to the Analogue Productions kind of finding that balance and doing what needed to be done to get her done. So at the end of the day, we're Sonics averaging here for the OG was 8.2, the UK was 7.4. Both of those, lost a half a point off the average because of those overages they had in their respective columns of treble for the US and bass for the UK. And we didn't have any of that with the Analogue Productions, and it was a 9.5. And when you factor in the vinyl with the Sonics, you end up with just barely over an 8 for the US OG, 7.5 on the UK, and 9.57 for the Analogue Productions. So when you factor in your cost per rating point, the first two, of course, are going to be lower dollars because the UHQR is obviously a high dollar item. But you get about $6 per rating point for the first US pressing, about $5.41 for the UK first pressing, and then $15.79 for the Analogue Productions. If this is a favorite album of yours and you want to hear it the best it can be, then hands down you want to get the Analogue Productions UHQR of Steely Dan's The Royal Scam. So sometimes these numbers come in with a bit of splitting hairs, but as I showed in the numbers, each of the pressings prior to this reissue had a characteristic that took it in the wrong direction, so to speak, relative to the sound. In the case of the US original, it was on the top end. And in the case of the UK, it was on the bottom end. And so Analogue Productions, I'm sure, in doing this, was trying to split the uprights, so to speak, to balance things out, to be able to do what it needed to do without doing any harm, without chopping off too much on the top end, which I think we saw a bit in the Pretzel Logic release. So this one kind of hits the sweet spot. It finds a way to get you where you need to be. It finds a way to give you better imaging, better soundstage, and separation while quelling some of the negatives and improving some of the positives. That's really a balancing act and a wire walk that Chad had to do, I believe, for this particular record. And the outcome is one that says, what is the best sounding copy? This is it for me. Now, maybe for you, that top end on an original doesn't bother you. I tend to like it on the top end, but yet it was a bit too much even for me. And another person I know who loves this album, has an OG, and had received his already and compared it, kind of said the same thing. That OG really was sharp on top, and I don't remember it being quite that frustrating in terms of it being fatiguing. Well, it is what it is. One has to listen and decide what they think. And at the end of the day, I would say that the Analogue Production certainly has been able to deliver the goods for this final release. I'm glad to have it. I love the fact that it's done right here in the US, and so much love and care was done with this particular release, as all of the Steely Dans were done before. One reminder I want to make on this video is that when it came to the Pretzel Logic and I reviewed it, I was like everyone else. I heard that the top end certainly had a ceiling on it, and there were things in it that we thought, where's the tap of the cymbal quite as strong as I heard in the original? And there were things in the rest of it in terms of especially the richness of the mid-range and some of the sounds that came out that maybe we hadn't quite heard it that way before, that made it a new listening experience. And so sometimes, because we're not the ones that have those original tapes and we don't have the outcome to see what would happen, we tend to think it can always go one way, and our bias tells us that's what to expect. But I really believe that these are done with the best intent of giving us the best outcome. And sometimes the outcome you think you might want isn't the one that you should desire. But you don't have the facts in front of you to make that call. In the case of the Royal Scam, I think, again, they really struck the right chord, no pun intended. On this record, we have something that brings out the best of what was there in the original master tape without forcing too much in either direction. And for me, when that happens, it's a home run. So as always, thanks for watching. If you haven't subscribed, please consider doing so by clicking on the bell. Share with your friends and give me a like or thumbs up, as well as comments. They're always welcome. I appreciate those that I get and try to answer most of them. So until we catch you next time on the Safe and Sound Texas Audio Excursion, take care, everybody.